Let's talk about nonlinear reverbs. So you might possibly be wondering, what's a nonlinear reverb and why is Eric obsessed with them? Well, it goes back to the 80s, because it always goes back to the 80s with me. Hugh Padgham and Steve Lillywhite came up with this reverb sound when they were working on a Peter Gabriel record, and it was tight, and it was dense, and it was explosive, and it was huge, but it also got out of the way. They did it with an SSL listen mic compressor, but soon everybody else figured out that as long as you slap a gate at the end of your reverb, you can do a lot. Then a company called AMS released a unit called the RMX16, which was a reverb unit which had a algorithm in it called Nonlinear 2 or Nonlin 2. And if you could select that, you could do pretty much the same thing without having to use a dedicated gate. And it was huge, and it was on every record in the 80s, whether it was R&B or arena rock or whatever. And then around 1990, everybody got collectively sick of it and stopped using it. But it's back now, and everybody's using it again. And now, because digital reverbs are cheap and in plug-in form and really powerful, they're everywhere. So let's look at a few.
First up, let's start with what you probably already have. Well, whatever DAW you're using might not exactly have a dedicated 1980s reverb. Chances are it's got something that'll do the job. I use Logic, so I've got both Space Designer and Chromaverb, and they both have a lot of presets that get pretty close. They've got gated/nonlinear presets. Like Chromaverb here has, this one's called 80s Nonlinear, which, it's pretty darn close. It doesn't work like an AMS RMX16 or whatever, but it's good enough. And if you're not a synthwave band or whatnot, it's probably going to be entirely sufficient for your needs. I know Ableton has a few presets like that, as does FL Studio, etc. But as we know, using what comes with your DAW isn't nearly as much fun as spending money on shiny new third-party toys. So let's look at a few of those shiny new third-party toys. Let's look at Valhalla Vintage Verb. This is sort of the 800-pound gorilla in the room when it comes to vintage reverbs. It sounds great. It's got an absolutely massive number of algorithms, and more get updated whenever they do a new version. It's easy to use. As you can see, it's got a very flat interface. Everything's right there, and it's cheap. It's $50. It's $50 for what could honestly be the only reverb you're ever going to need. It's got all sorts of halls and rooms and giant spaces, and a recent update brought the emulation of the Quantec Room Simulator, which is an old vintage verb that, I never thought I would see in a $50 reverb. It's kind of nuts. And then a few updates ago, they added this nonlinear algorithm that essentially functions like the old AMS Nonlin 2. That's what I'm going to focus on here because that's what we're talking about. It gets a little weird on this one because it does this weird thing where it doesn't give you control over things other than the decay time, and you can control the room size and shape, but the decay shape is controlled by repurposing the attack time knob. So that's a little weird, but you get used to it. It's a smidge counterintuitive, but what you gonna do? So I've got a drum loop here. Let's put it on the drums and you can hear what it does. Here's dry. Could change the shape a little bit here. And you get some other controls that are kind of neat. You can control the era. So if you picked like 1980s, it changes the color of the UI, but it also changes the downsampling and bandwidth of the internal routing. So you can kind of get some cool effects. I There's 80s, there's 70s. It's got now, which is a lot cleaner. And it's got all these other things for handling EQ and modulation. Uh, and unlike traditional old school reverb units, you can pick arbitrary decay times and pre delay times instead of just selecting whatever was pre programmed into the machine. It doesn't have a built in gate, so if you want to do the true gated reverb sound, you actually need to add a gate. Honestly, though, even if you're not looking for a nonlinear reverb, Valhalla is pretty much like the most you're going to get bang for the buck wise. It's massive, massive value on that one. A new entry into this is Wave Alchemy Glow. It's kind of an outlier in that it isn't straight up a general purpose reverb. It's directly an emulation of the AMS RMX16, the classic nonlinear reverb. The RMS16 is a legendary piece of kit. It was everywhere during the 80s. And it's that nonlinear 2 algorithm became sort of the definitive 80s snare and tom reverb sound. Now, an actual RMS16 is almost impossible to get your hands on for a punter like me, but Universal Audio does make a fully licensed emulation, but at the moment it requires their DSP stuff, which I don't have. Your boy is all native, but they've announced native versions of all their plugins, and that may change. But for now, pretty much all we got is this new Glow. So I'm pleasantly surprised when this came out. It's reasonably inexpensive. As I am filming this, it's about $50 on sale, although I think the actual list price is going to be a little more than that, so it might vary. It's a bit more esoteric than the others, but it's also intended to be hardware accurate. For me, that makes sense because I use this kind of sound a lot for a lot of my stuff. So a reasonably priced emulation was sort of a no-brainer purchase for me, and it provided it does what it says on the tin. So let's see if it does what it says. There's the dry drum loop. And there's that big 80s slapback right there. Naturally, I'm using some 80s style drums to get just the right vibe here. So yeah, in short, it does what it says it's going to do. It's got a few nice extra features like a ducker that ducks the reverb out of the whale. And it's got a modern switch, which modernizes the sound. I think it changes some internal sampling and EQ routings and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's, for $50, if you need that sound, it's pretty good. Let's see. The next one, Good Hertz Megaverb. At $95, this one's probably one of the more expensive on the list for a specialized reverb, but it's arguably the most flexible. It's also kind of the hardest to control. They call it a good bad reverb, and it's definitely designed to do trashy vintage digital reverb kind of things. You've heard this one actually if you've heard Lil Nas X's Montero. But you can switch between gated and ducked reverbs. There's this gate mode, ducking mode, has a cute little duck icon there, or a gate mode. Cute. But you can't use both at the same time, so you can't gate your ducks or duck your gates, which is a really weird thing to say. There are 4 main algorithms in here, A, B, C, and D. They don't tell you exactly what each one is, but you kind of get general ballpark. A is your standard sort of resonant digital reverb. B is a nonlinear algorithm. Show you with the icons. C is a smoother, bigger reverb, and D is for doing long, deep stuff. And there are presets that come with it that sort of bear this out. There's a whole bank of these historical ones, like Susudio and Hounds of Love and Let's Dance. And Theme from Ernest Borgnine is in here somewhere. Polynomial C. And then there's a mess of these shoegaze presets, and there's lo-fi effects. And I mean, their presets are really well done. It's got a lot of horsepower under the hood. So it's got some pretty standard controls, delay, pre-delay, decay. It does tempo sync on the pre-delay, which is really nice and can be musically interesting. So if you wanted to set the pre-delay to a eighth note, that's how you do it. Or an eighth note dotted, triplet. Time, I set it to 0. It's got some lo-fi degradation in the form of analog overdrive or clipping, digital bit crushing. I recommend using that judiciously because it can get pretty gnarly pretty quick. So unless you're going for a specific effect, it's going to get out of hand. And then there's this whole separate panel over here for additional controls over gate timing, gate range, side chaining, detector modes. It's a lot, and it's easy to get lost in the weeds on this. And every time I open this panel, I inevitably do. And the gate does exactly what it says. It's a gate at the end of the reverb. It's affects the entire wet signal, not just the individual hits. So that can be kind of a mixed blessing, since if you're routing on a bus, you can kind of ungate things unexpectedly. It's kind of more authentic in that way, since that's how a real gated reverb would work. But it can be a little weird to suddenly have your snare reverb cut back in because a tom hit just went. So there's a lot of programming powerhouse stuff going on in here, and honestly, though, the presets are fantastic, and I kind of just stick with them. My dirty little secret is most of the time whenever I use this reverb, I just pull up Hounds of Love and tweak a few decay times, and it pretty much does exactly what I need it to. I'm not Kate Bush, but I do love that snare sound. So let's hear what that preset sounds like. Dry. Except that's Born in the USA. That's an even tighter gate. So you kind of get the idea on that one. Like I said, it's a little tricky to use sometimes, but it can give you some really great results. The next one up is Baby Audio Crystalline. This is kind of a new one. They're an interesting company because kind of what they focus on are really, really streamlined workflows. So instead of parameter diving, menu diving, tweaking parameters, they just tend to give you some big icon knobs that are fairly easy to understand for dialing in your sound. Like in this case, if I wanted to change the size, I just kind of click here. It's big, it's small. Yeah. Now, Crystalline is an all-purpose reverb, and because of some of its other features, it's kind of become one of my go-tos. It's got adjustable ducking down here, which gets the reverb tail out of the way of the next hit. It's got automatic tempo sync for just about everything, which is great if you're a dance music producer because everything's tempo synced. And of course, it has this gate. You can set the gate threshold and the release time, which gives you a lot of control over the shaping. It's not strictly speaking an 80s retro reverb nonlinear thing, but it gives you enough similarity in the functionality that it lands you in the same ballpark. And like I said, if you produce dance music, you may be considering this for other reasons. So there you go. It sounds really good too. Let's hear it dry. this one on. This is their big snare 80s preset, but it makes judicious use of the gate. Mess around with the resolution. Gets a little grittier there. Turn up the modulation. This part is cool. You can mess with the transients. So that's Baby Audi Crystalline. There's a lot of tone shaping stuff in there. There's a shimmer control, which changes the EQ of the tail. There's stereo width, modulation, depth, sampling rate. It gives you that gritty vintage tone if you go to a lower sampling rate and so forth. $99, it's a little pricier than some on this list, but it's definitely aimed at being an all-purpose reverb. And I gotta admit, it does sound really great. And the tempo sync makes it stupidly useful for me because I do dance music, most of the time anyway. Now this one's a little unusual. Slate Digital Verb Suite Classics. It's a collaboration with Liquid Sonics. It's a bit of an outlier because it's not an algorithmic reverb like the others. It's a convolution reverb, meaning it basically samples an existing reverb using impulse responses, and then uses these to uses their decay characteristics to emulate the original. So most DAWs come with a basic convolution reverb. There's a Space Designer in Logic, convolution reverb in Ableton, and then there's a big famous one called Altiverb, which is eye-wateringly expensive, so I don't own it. But they all work pretty much the same way. What tends to separate them is the IR libraries that they come with and whether you can load your own. Now, this one you can't load your own, but it comes with a pretty extensive library. It's either $149 retail, which is a little pricey, but if you've got the Slate All Access Pass subscription, which includes a lot of other stuff, it comes with that. And it has a ton of sampled reverb units like the Eventide 2016, the TC M2000, the EMT 250, Lexicon 480, and a whole bunch of others, which I don't actually know what they are because as much as I like reverb, haven't been paying close attention. And it comes with a couple expansion packs, one of which has the Bricasti M7, which the M7 is a glorious reverb unit. And I will say this sounds pretty close to it. It's not quite the same, but it's pretty good. But anyway, this isn't about the M7. It comes with a bunch of RMX 16 IRs, so you can get pretty much the Nonlinear 2 stuff, and it's really good at it. It's a little smoother, a little more modern than a lot of the emulations, at least to my ears, but that might be the result of the convolution process. It doesn't quite have that grainy 80s digital sound, which, might not always be a bad thing. So here's what it sounds like. You have a little control over a few of the options, chorus, width. Change the attack. That's kind of interesting. Doesn't do a whole lot, but it can be subtle. Change the decay times. That's a little weird, but, could be musically useful. Who knows? So that one's a great option if you want a lot of different reverb styles. Liquid Sonics has done a great job of overcoming some of the issues of convolution reverbs. While they're usually really great for real physical sampled spaces, they can often sound a little static compared to their analog brethren because of the way modulation is done. And also, because the math is relatively insane, convolution reverbs are a bit heavier on the CPU and the libraries take up more disk space. But that was all a bigger deal when they started making these things. Now, A lot less so because computers have a lot more storage and a lot more CPU, but still. So there you go.
So there are a lot of great options here if you're in the need of an 80s reverb sound for your Dead or Alive tribute band or your Def Leppard tryout tape. Glow is definitely the most limited of the bunch, but it's also the most purpose-built. If it's something you need to use a lot, like I do, it's probably a good investment. It's fairly esoteric though, so your mileage may vary. Valhalla Vintage Verb is probably the most versatile reverb you're ever going to own, and ironically, it's probably the cheapest. Even if you don't need a specific 80s reverb, it's still ridiculously flexible and sounds utterly great. Verb Suite is also flexible and sounds fantastic, but it's more expensive and more resource intensive than the others, and it's also tied into a specific ecosystem. Crystalline isn't exactly purpose built, but it's fast. It gets you where you want to go, and the built-in gate tools work great for that vintage sound, and it's a click or two away from a gritty digital vibe, and it comes with a few features that make it really great for beat-based music. Now, Megaverb is interesting. Like a lot of Good Hurt stuff, it's really powerful, but it's also pretty esoteric. I don't find myself reaching for it as much as I used to because I tend to seek quicker options. It sounds great, but the workflow can be a little fiddly. So now kind of wondering if I should like shoot out talkback compressor plugins because there are a couple of those too. But whatever. So that's nonlinear reverbs. The YouTube algorithm knows all, sees all, and controls our lives. So in the spirit of that, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more studio videos and music videos. Also, feel free to check out Null Device, Clack, or EdgeCase Development Corporation on Bandcamp or your favorite streaming site. Thank you.